Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast, bringing you interviews, reviews, and fishing tips. Here's your host, Pete Tigus.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Fly Culture Podcast. My name is Pete Tigus. Today, I'm really pleased to be heading over to Texas to speak with Steve Ramirez. He's a fly angler and author, and we're going to talk a lot about his fishing and also about his awesome book, Casting Forward. So I'm really pleased to introduce Steve Ramirez today. Steve, it's great to have you here. Thanks for getting up bright and early to speak with me. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Pete, and thank you so much for inviting me.
You're most welcome. And there's so much to talk about today. We'll move on to the book at some stage, but a lot of your fishing, and I know we were talking off mic about the fishing that you've done, and it seems as though there's not many places that you've not fished in the US, but being based in Texas, I thought it was really interesting, as it ties with your book quite nicely as well, to learn a little bit about bass fishing and the other species that you catch there and how that came about, perhaps a little bit about the species as a whole, how you fish for them, and go from there. But I thought a really good place to start was to learn about how fly fishing came to you and where that journey started for you. Where was that?
Actually, my father was a fly angler, but never took me fly fishing. We did other forms of outdoor things together. And that piqued my interest. As I got older, I went off, and you may have seen in the book that I served in the Marines. And after getting out of the Marines a few years later, I realized that I was dealing with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and used nature often as a healing power. And fly fishing I entered self-taught into fly fishing, and that's where it all began, here in the Texas Hill Country.
And could you tell us a little bit about the fishing that you're doing there? Because I know in the book that you talk about many rivers and places that you're actually hitting. Is it mainly rivers that you like to go explore for these fish?
Yes, and we talked off mic about the Guadalupe bass, the state fish of Texas, only found endemic only to the Texas Hill Country. And the Texas Hill Country is a very unique place. To some degree, I wrote this book as a love letter to the Hill Country, hoping that I could help get people interested in trying to save it. And so 21 chapters, almost 21 rivers. Most people don't realize that we have beautiful spring-fed, limestone-based rivers all across the Texas Hill Country. It got named the Hill Country by the state of Texas because it sounded like a nice way to attract tourists, but it's really canyon country. And of course, canyons are created by rivers. They're crystal clear, sometimes so clear that you can think you're stepping into 2 feet of water and you end up in 4. And Guadalupe bass are bass that think they're trout. They like faster water. You can take them on a dry fly, though I tend to use streamers. And I guess a big difference is someone who's fished for both trout and bass and love both. A friend of mine who's a local guide, Kevin Hutchison, says trout fishing is ballet and bass fishing is a street fight. And I think that's true. They just come out fully fighting and jumping and leaping. And so that's how I got started in fly fishing in these rivers. These rivers crisscross this countryside in the center of Texas. It's kind of an island of canyons and hills, surrounded by flat scrub and desert. It's a very unique place.
And so obviously, I guess that it's not the sort of environment for trout. Is the water temperature where you're based, does that mean it is a little bit higher and trout don't live in those streams?
It is warmer water. Trout are not native to here. We have one part of the Guadalupe River that's under a dam that's a tailwater where they release the water at 400 feet below. So it comes out cold. And trout have been placed there. And we have rainbow and brown trout in that area. And I write about that in the book as well on Casting Forward. But they're not from there. And oddly enough, I do a lot of work with Trout Unlimited. And the largest Trout Unlimited chapter is the Guadalupe chapter. which is unique in that trout aren't from here. So, but we do have them, but they're, like I said, they're not native. This is a warmer water climate.
Does that mean then, just talking about your Trout Unlimited chapter, does that mean there's a pretty large numbers of hardcore fly anglers in your area?
Yes, there is. Fly fishing is almost a religion here. So there is a very big fly fishing community from Austin to San Antonio and across the hill country. Now, with that said, one of the things I currently love is that I can still fish a river and not see another person. And I love that. Hopefully I haven't ruined that with this book.
So where does that actually come from? That because you wouldn't necessarily consider Texas a fly fishing hotspot. What is that, numbers of people, or is it, what makes that so big?
I think culturally this area has been more open to fly fishing, and this is me just making a guess, because the landscape is open to fly fishing as a technique, first of all, because we have faster waters, we have waterfalls and pools and all those things. We have Guadalupe bass, which, as I said, are bass that think they're trout. And it could also be, for whatever reason, the Texas Hill Country has historically been a place where people looking for a more enlightened life have flocked to. And by enlightened, I mean during the time of Texas when there was slavery, that was an area that was anti-slavery. It was free thinkers from Europe that came here to create their own sort of utopian worlds. Of course, utopias never quite work out, but we even have a town called Utopia. So I think this place just seems poetic, and so it lends itself to fly fishing, which to me is somewhat poetic when I'm not hooking a tree.
So tell me about the Guadalupe bass. I love the name for starters, but would you describe, because obviously in the UK we don't have bass as such to fish for in the rivers. How would you describe Guadalupe bass, and what other species might you find when you're on the river too?
Well, first I'll speak of the Guadalupe, which I have to say is my favorite fish in the world. And I've fished salt and fresh, cold and warm water, but I'm biased. So it is closely akin to the smallmouth bass in other parts of America. And it doesn't get as large as the Florida bass that you pursued. Those get, routinely 9 pounds is very easy. The Guadalupe bass, the record is slightly over 3 pounds, so a smaller fish. The average one we catch would be about 1.5 pounds. If you're going down the Llano River, for example, on a good day, you may pick up between half a dozen and a dozen Guadalupes mixed with other fish that you're going to catch. They tend to like faster water than the Florida black bass or the northern black bass, which you also have here. So as part of your second question, we have northern black bass as well in these waters. The slower waters tend to carry the black bass, like you saw in Florida, similar. The faster waters have Guadalupes. Guadalupes will hit surface flies. I tend to use streamers. It's a straight line cast and swing and strip sort of streamer fishing that I do most often with Guadalupes. They strike hard and they fight hard. And they're beautiful fish. They tend to be emerald green with cream white bellies and green spotting along the belly that makes them very unique, and sort of a sun ray burst across their face when you get a really bright one. The other fish in this area, largemouth bass. Unfortunately, some of our waters do have smallmouth bass, and I say unfortunately because years ago, Texas Parks and Wildlife didn't realize that if they took those foreign bass from other parts of America and dumped them in these waters, that they were going to start causing the Guadalupe to go extinct through crossbreeding. We're trying to rectify that now here in the Hill Country. We also have a great little fish called a Rio Grande cichlid, which are stunningly beautiful, and they fight much stronger than they should for their size. And then a whole bunch of different varieties of sunfish, about a half a dozen varieties of sunfish that you can catch here. And that's a lot of the fishing you're doing. There's garfish, there's catfish, but most people are trying to get the sunfish and bass.
You painted the picture beautifully, and I sort of had in my mind, I guess, a smaller version of the Colorado River, that there wasn't much color in there wasn't much visibility in the water, and you were sort of throwing streamers and pulling them through the water in the hope. But this sounds a completely different and even more exciting ball game, that I guess you can almost see those fish as they come out from their lie to eat your streamer as well, I guess, don't you?
It depends on where you're at, because you're right, there are going to be certain rivers where there's more siltation, and you're going to have less visibility, so you'll see them at the last moment. But there are rivers here like the Frio, parts of the Guadalupe, the Llano, that are so clear that it's like sight casting to bonefish. And it can get, on parts of the Frio, for example, I've had it so it's so difficult just to get up to them because they see you way before you see them. Which is the fun. That's the fun part. So it can be different in different waters. Some of our rivers have a crushed jade green color to them. It depends on the geology. And that's another thing I love about this region. The water's clean, but it's different depending on which area you're going to. And the fish are different. So it causes, one of the things I love about fly fishing is we tend to be naturalists. We're learning about the insects. We're learning about the waters. We're learning how to read the water. It's the same here. You start noticing what they're eating, what's around in riparian habitat. It's the same as you would see in the UK going after brown trout.
Yeah. And I know you mentioned in the book that, and I think you did as well when we started talking about dry flies as well, and I guess you get mayfly hatches there, and the Guadalupe bass rise to them in effect, do they?
They do. It's not their number one food, but we'll get slate drakes and other mayflies here that they will strike right off the top. And so topwater fishing is quite doable for Guadalupes and other fish, as well as using poppers. But you're right about what you said about the Colorado fishing. If you fish the Colorado River, a lot of what I do, simply because it's so effective, is you're tossing streamers, and slack is not your friend. And it really is more combat than art to that. But you're very much connected. And the other thing that makes this place beautiful is the amount of wildlife we have. Texas has over 4 million deer, which is too many. So you're surrounded by deer, bird life, all kinds of things that are coming around you while you're fishing. And all of that is part of the experience. Not to mention you have to try the barbecue.
The food in there, I was going to mention about that, where in the book you talk about sangria and tacos and everything else that goes with it, and there obviously is a theme running through the book with that as well. That excites and interests me deeply as well. So perhaps we'll come on to that in a second. I was kind of interested to know, from a fishing perspective, coming back to the bass very, very quickly, that are you applying, as an experienced angler in many spheres of it, are you applying sort of the trout techniques that you would for reading the water? Are these fish sitting in bubble lines, or are they sitting in front of drop-offs, snags? How would you look for a bass, and where would you be looking for them?
It is much the same, though they're different in the way they react to their environment, but they're a fish, so obviously they're waiting for food to come on the conveyor belt. The difference with bass too is they're ambush predators, so they may be in slower waters from time. You are going to look for overhangs, snags, undercuts. You're reading the river that way, deep pools, and the fish that you find, just as you would expect with trout, depend. So you may find smaller bass in more shallow water, and larger bass in deeper water. I have a good friend here who's a Guadalupe bass biologist. He's the lead in protecting them right now, Preston Bean. And he tells me he likes to drag a crawfish across the bottom of deep pools to get the big ones. I haven't done a lot of that, but by crawfish, I mean a crawfish fly. And I tend to do, and I'm not actually going for big ones myself. Anybody who fishes with me finds that I'm not hardcore. I'm just enjoying it. So I can fish hardcore with the people who want to, but I just have a good time. So yes, you are reading the water, and you're getting a feel for it, and it's what you would expect because trout and bass both need food and oxygen and shelter.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do you tend to fish with? Is it 5 and 6 weight rods, or lighter or heavier?
I tend to fish with a 5 weight rod most of the time. If I think I'm going to get into some large fish or I'm going to be doing some distance work on a wider river, that sometimes I'll use my 8 weight, just like I would for saltwater. If I'm going to get into some bass that might be in the 3 to 6 pound range, then I might use my 8 weight. But normally I'm fishing with a 5 weight, just like I would for trout. And I happen to absolutely love fishing with glass, fiberglass. So I use a lot of that, even though I do have graphite. 5 weight is very perfect for these waters. When you get into a big bass, you're going to have a fight on your hands. But I've brought in 3.5 pound bass on my 5 weight, and I've had other times I was glad I had the 8. We also have different I didn't mention 2 fish that you can catch here that are not from here but are now naturalized, and that is striped bass, which are oceanic, and they get quite large. And we have those, they go up our rivers to spawn from lakes, and we also have white bass, and both of those will put some fight. You might have a bigger rod.
And is there, I guess there's a particular time you know when to fish for them, but what drives them? Because at home, I'm thinking about our freestone rivers or spate rivers, that rain brings the rivers up and the fish can run up the river more easily. I guess it's slightly different for you, and particularly, again, having read the book, and there's a lovely line where you say you needed rain and it rained for a week, but you still had a drought. So I guess the fish don't rely on rain to lift the river up in the same way that we do.
Rain's still important. So we are over 2 aquifers, the Edwards Aquifer and the Trinity Aquifer. Those are 2 major ones. So we have springs that are feeding these rivers. But of course, if you don't get enough rain, the aquifer drops and the springs can even dry up. So rain is important. That cycle is important. The answer about when to fish is, this is a year-long fishery. When the water's warmer, but not too hot, it gets better. In the winter, it gets slower because these are warm water fish. So but I have caught fish in the dead of winter and in the boiling heat of summer. And when I say boiling heat, Texas can get so hot in the summer. I tend to fish for a while and then I jump in. That's just jump in and cool off and then fish some more because it can get brutally hot in the summer in Texas. It's a year-round fishery, and you adapt depending on, you made the comment about the drought. One of the jokes here is Texas only has 2 seasons, flood and drought. And it can seem true. We've had rain for weeks past to this, and now we're going straight back into drought again. So these have to be tough fish.
Yeah, it sounds it to me. It really does. It's really been eye-opening for me to read and learn about something I didn't know so much about. But I wanted to move on because you said that you fished around the country for all sorts of species of fish, and you actually lived in Montana. Texas is clearly where you love to be, where you love to fish. Is there anywhere that has a special place in your heart that's away from Texas, or is it just too difficult to get you away from there?
Oh, no. My second book, and I'm not saying this to plug a book, but what I did on purpose is casting forward was meant to introduce the world to this beautiful little place that I'm lucky enough to live. And I've lived all over the world, by the way. I think you know that my wife is British, born and raised in Scotland. My daughter is a British citizen, and she lives in the UK permanently. I've lived all over Europe and Africa, South America, and found something beautiful in all these places. The second book, I went out like ripples from a pond, and I've gone all over the United States learning about the home waters of other people by going fishing with them for trout, bass, pike, muskie, you name it, striped bass. So are there places I absolutely love? I tend to, in the second book, I think many people in the UK will find this interesting. If you're coming to the United States, I highly recommend to try to target some of our native species that you cannot find in the UK. You can catch brown trout in the UK, and I would rather catch them there. But we have, for example, Gila trout in New Mexico and Rio Grande trout in New Mexico. These are native species. Apache trout in Arizona. The red band trout in the deserts of Idaho. Another thing, if someone wanted to go to one state but have an amazingly different experience, I would highly recommend going to Utah and doing the Utah Cutthroat Slam, where you're getting 4 different kinds of cutthroat, and that's in my book as well. Not because I'm into the slam, but because you have to experience 4 different habitats, 4 different kinds of rivers, and these fish are stunningly beautiful. They may not be big, but they're beautiful. So if you love small stream technical fishing, and I do, it's for you. That's my bias outside of Guadalupe. I love fishing for native trout in high remote waters. But there's so many things to do here. If you're coming from the UK and coming to the United States and you want bigger fish, then float down to St. Croix between Minnesota and Wisconsin, which is what I do with Bob White, and fish for huge pike, muskie, and wonderful smallmouth bass. These are all great options for someone coming here.
Yeah, there are so many. It's interesting, the cutthroat thing I'm fascinated by, and the Bonnevilles have been on my list for some time now, and like you say, the Apache and everything else. And even I love, and I may get abuse for it, but I love whitefish as well because we don't have them, and I think they're kind of cool as well. I like them for what they are, and like you say, they're a native fish, aren't they?
They are, and that's right up my alley. I love catching native fish in their native waters. So if I'm going to try to get a golden trout, I don't try to get a big golden trout in Wyoming in a pond where they don't belong. I go to the golden trout wilderness and I fish for them in the high mountain streams where they do belong. That's just me. Some people just want to see, well, where do they grow the biggest? And I want to see, where do they grow the wildest? That's one of the joys. If I go to another country to fish or hike or whatever I'm doing, I try to find out where's the place you're going in your home, not where all the tourists are going. So, and if Pete, if you make it down this way, I'll take you fishing.
Oh, I'm in. I tell you, you've got me already. Having read that, you've got me. Yeah. Now, before we move on to talk a little bit about the book, and I know we sort of skirted around and through the subject a little bit, but I wanted to find out a little bit more. But one of the themes that I really enjoyed through it was the relationship with your daughter, Megan, and particularly her relationship with you and fishing as a whole as well. And it struck me as though that was a really interesting part of it. And does her passion run as deep as yours does for fishing? Because I kind of got the sense she really does enjoy it too.
It does when she's with me. And that's the strange thing. She lives in the UK now, and I'm going to be bringing her fly gear the next time I can get over there. But she has only been fishing with me. And for a long time, she was my only fishing companion. I taught her to fly fish, and then she went on to cast easily, far better and more beautifully than me. Sometimes I would simply stop and watch her fish. It was like watching a ballet. And so, yes, I am so grateful that I have a close relationship with my daughter, center of my world in so many ways. And we went through a time in which I needed to reinvent and she needed to reinvent. And she turned to me and said, "So, Dad, what are we going to do?" And I said, "I think we'll go fishing for a year and not worry about it. We'll just figure it out." She had finished her bachelor's degree at Vanderbilt and was trying to think of what's coming next. And I was moving from one career path to another. And I said, "Our plan is have no plan. This is a good moment in life just to enjoy it." And I was able to do that. So we fished every single river in the hill country together. She's not in every chapter, as you notice, but every one I could take her on, I did. And I think through that, angling is something we can pass down from generation to generation like the greatest gift we can give. I think it has more value than a college education. And I have multiple degrees that are sitting in the closet in bubble wrap right now, and I never think about them. But passing on angling from my father to me and from me to my daughter has been a gift. As you know, it's far more than about catching fish. It's far more. And so I'm very grateful. We had our best times. My favorite chapter happens to be Devils, of the Devil's River. And that was a time when she was trying to decide whether to go and move to the UK to get her master's degree, which she did, or stay in Texas. And I knew she had to go. And I wanted her to find that on her own. So I took her out for several days on the Devil's River, which, if you ever get to be out here, it's very remote. You have to drive for over 40 miles on dirt roads just to get to the gate. And it's stunningly beautiful, where a river puts a green belt through the middle of a desert, covered in wildlife and birds. And we ended up spending several days there, and at the end of it, after being under the stars in this wild Texas land, she said, "Dad, I do have to go, don't I?" I said, "Absolutely, you got to do this." So if we think of the times we have with each other, that's the other thing I'm writing in the second book. It's me with these people. It's someone like you and I getting together and fishing, and it's the first time we meet, and we fish, and you know how that is? Everything clicks. We've got so much in common because of angling, because of nature. It draws certain people. Fly angling especially. I think it draws certain people. We tend to be a bit philosophical, a bit poetic. We read, which is good for me since I'm writing books. So I hope I answered your question there.
Absolutely, you did 100%, and it's been fascinating for me because my daughter used to fish with me all the time, and I've mentioned this possibly on previous podcasts, and then it became less and less and less, and she drifted apart, and she fished with me on the Gallatin just outside the park in Yellowstone and caught some fish, got herself a license and we fished together, which was great. And then it was interesting last year that we had some great water for salmon. So we went down and she had a boyfriend with her and we were spey casting and she's like, you know, and there were fish about. My wife, Emma, hooked 2, which sadly came off, but her boyfriend was transfixed by it. And it was interesting to see that move from her sort of former interest. She's like him wanting to go, yet her boyfriend saying, I want to stay, I want to stay, I want to fish. So it may be that, and my hope is that with both of them that I share some more fishing experiences with. But it was interesting to see. But I found I couldn't force my passion onto her. I felt it was important for her to find her own way, and she gradually drifted away from it, I guess.
And I would say Megan has 2 right now. Her life is, you know, she lives, like I said, she lives in England, and she hasn't been fly fishing since she's there. But as soon as I can get there, when things change with COVID, I am planning for us to go fishing in England. So, and by the way, it was supposed to be in the second book that I fly out there and go fishing with her, but with COVID, I couldn't go. So, I find a similar situation, and my daughter's partner, I would love to get him hooked on fly fishing, but you don't force anything on anyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's really important. Now, I'd like to track back a tiny bit because you openly and candidly said that you'd suffered with PTSD. And I've worked with Fishing for Heroes over here as well and seen how fly fishing has been so important for them. And seeing when I'm on the water with them that everything sort of disappears and focus is on the fishing and helps clear everything else out of their head. Do you mind me asking if if it's been a similar sort of help for you in that same way?
It's a great question. And in the book, there's a chapter, San Gabriel, which is focused on this idea. And the answer is, without fly fishing in nature, I would not be alive today. I feel certain of that. I'll say without fly fishing in nature and my love of my family, I would not be alive today. And I'm not afraid to share that. And I still struggle with PTSD. And I just turned 60 years old. So it's something that becomes part of your life, like high blood pressure. Fly fishing, you absolutely hit it exactly right. It focuses you on living in the moment. It is meditative. It is healing. And it is, I've worked with here. You said Heroes on the Water is in the UK? Was that the title?
Fishing for Heroes.
Fishing for Heroes. Okay, we have Project Healing Waters, which I volunteered with. And I try to include speaking of it in everything I write, just about. Because I think, not just for people with PTSD from military or police experiences, which I've done both, PTSD for people that have had childhood trauma, whatever it happens to be, I think fly fishing is a wonderful tonic.
And do you think as we come on to the book now as well, do you think writing that book was a part of that journey as well? And that was a small part of a healing process, getting those words down onto paper and what it meant to you and some of the experiences too? Absolutely.
Absolutely. And my hope is, as you can see, this is not just a fishing book. It's much more. And my hope is that people are going to read this and they're going to say, that's me. I understand that in my own story. I understand. I want them to feel the water on their legs. I want them to see the dragonflies. I want them to feel the fish, but I also want them to feel the peace and the struggle, because we all struggle. That's life. It's not good or bad. It's just life. And so, yes, writing this book, writing the second one, and now writing the third one is self-healing. It gives me hope. So you may see in there that I spent 35 years of my life armed and dealing with the worst of society. Fly fishing and the people I meet through fly fishing and nature activities in general help me focus that most people are good, that most people are decent. And I think in the current age, for sure, we need that message. We need to remind ourselves that there's a lot of good in the world, not just what we see on the news.
Yeah. I know somebody said to me when I first started that they said they wished the world was full of fly anglers, and that's a kind of neat comment.
It is. Now, this is definitely a healing process, but what I want it to be is a healing process for everyone, because all of us have our struggles. And part of what I can equate almost everything philosophically in life to fly fishing. It teaches you about everything being impermanent, about letting go, about, just reading what's happening in front of you and reacting to that and moving with it. There's so many things fly fishing teaches. And whenever things get a bit rough or bumpy, as I say, I just tell my wife, I need to go fishing. And that's pretty much the tonic.
Yeah, I think that for everyone, it's a top up, isn't it? And we feel energized, and I'm sure there's many other pastimes that do the same. I don't know about them because I don't need them because I've got fishing, but definitely being able to just be there. And I'm sort of, it's warm here at the moment, nothing like Texas, but I'm sort of sitting thinking, perhaps I will go tonight and see if I can find a rising trout. And sometimes one's enough. And like, I'm just so like you that I don't care about the size. It's nice, obviously, if I find a nice fish, but being there, and I think how you put about having the water on your legs, it says so much, actually. And I agree wholeheartedly with that. And that sense of being where you feel at ease and where you feel comfortable and where almost in some ways feels like home, I guess.
Yes. And that joy this past year and a half for me has been visiting people like you and saying, teach me about your home. I'm planning on writing one in the future in which I'm inviting people to come here, and I'm going to say, let me teach you about mine. Let me show you. I think this kind of connection that we all have is really, really important, and that's part of why I wrote this book. And by the way, even the cover of the book is symbolic. Everything is very much planned out with calm water at the top and moving water at the bottom. The second book will be the same. The third will be the same in a different way. So there's a lot of symbolism for people to pick out of this.
Nice. I hadn't spotted that, but that's a really interesting point. And I was sort of thinking about each chapter that you wrote in Casting Forward, and I think I said I liked how each chapter is held together with a fishing trip or day, yet carries a part of you and how you feel about that subject with it. I guess that was a conscious decision, as I guess you've alluded to previously.
Yes. And you'll notice that I always start a chapter with a quote that I've selected from someone. And that quote carries the story forward as well. So the story happens as it happened, but the way we see the story depends on what we're looking for, what we're open to. So I hope people find it poetic, fun. I hope sometimes it makes them laugh, and I hope sometimes it makes us think. It does for me. And the funny thing is, maybe it's because my mind's getting older, I can read something that I wrote years ago and not remember that I wrote it. So I said, oh, did I write that? So it can be fresh for me too.
Yeah. And I get the sense, I could be wrong, and I get the sense it flowed quite easily, the writing process for you. Would I be right in that, or did you have to sometimes grind words out? It just feels to me as though it flows quite naturally and doesn't feel laboured in the writing. It's really beautifully written.
Thank you so much for that. It means a lot for you to say that. When I write, it tends to feel as if someone else is writing it for me. So what I mean is I sit down and it just comes. Now there's editing. I think Hemingway said books aren't written, they're edited, and I think he was spot on. I edit, but the editing is the chiseling of the words, to making sure that you've got the rhythm the way you want it. But you're exactly right. It flows for me. It just comes out. And I relive the fishing so that you can relive it. So I'm writing one right now for the third book, and I'm up in Long Island Sound with a friend of mine, David Blinken. And all I have to do is live the moment with him again in my mind so that the reader gets all of it and feels what the water was like, what the wind was like, what the sun was like. And that's what I want. I want that reader to have the experience with me as if they went along.
And do you find then that that process, when you're writing, do you find that sometimes you can leave it for a few days and the mood takes you and then it suddenly rushes out? Or do you find that you sit down at the computer or write it or whatever you use and it just comes out in one go? Or do you find that, you sort of go out for a walk and then come back and you've got a chapter suddenly there sitting in front of you?
Great questions, Pete. I write until I realize I'm done. And sometimes that might just be 800 words. Sometimes it could be 1,500 words. But chapters are multiple sessions to get a chapter even and rough. So often you may notice that I'm mixing the actual fly fishing with meanderings that may be philosophical or about nature. I'm hoping that the reader has fun and has the trip with me, and then accidentally learns things along the way. At the end, they're thinking, well, I didn't know that. Or that makes me think about how I'm handling that. So no, there's multiple. I go with the flow, not to overuse the pun. I just did a piece where I was writing all this action with bluefish. And when I got done with that piece of action, I knew it was time to stop. I'll come back to it today, and we will swing into a different mode. So I think, again, I'm going to probably falsely quote Hemingway saying that I'm such a simple writer that the weather outside is the weather in my book. Well, I put myself into that moment, and then we follow with it until I think I've mastered telling that moment, and then I stop, and I come back to it. The other thing I do is I reread everything I started in that chapter. So if I've written 2,000 words to a chapter, I go read the 2,000 before I write another 1,000. Make sure that I'm flowing back into the story the way I came into it the first time. That's my style.
Nice. I know I had a guest on here from Utah, funny enough, Chad Van Zanten, and he's written a couple of books now, possibly 3, and we were talking about it, and I said sometimes if I want to write something, there might be weeks where I can't write what I want to say, yet I can go out and come back in again, having walked the dog by the stream that runs through our village, come back, and I say to Emma, I've just got to write something quickly. And it may just be something that I want to share with people about how I feel about something. And it can be anything, usually driven around or around fishing. But it's funny, and then I might go a month or two without feeling that emotion to be able to write that. I guess that's a harder thing to do when you're writing a book, though, isn't it? If you're writing to a deadline.
Well, the only deadlines I have are mine, because I do it differently than some other friends of mine who are authors. I write the entire book and then present it to my editor, and I actually timed them so that when Casting Forward was coming out on November 1st, I was handing my editor the second book on November 10th, which is the Marine Corps birthday, so we had planned that ahead of time. So I'm very disciplined about my own deadline, but I'm not writing on someone else's deadline. And I actually do what you're saying, because, for example, I may go back to the Llano River, not the time that I'm writing about, and then I see something new. One thing is my friend Bob White, and you know his paintings. He's omnipotent. I mean, he can put someone in the river or he can take them out. When he's painting, he paints the river. If he wants to paint you in, he can paint you in. If you're standing in the river and he doesn't want you in there, he could leave you out. I can do that with the stories too. So if I'm having that walk like you are with your dog, and something comes to me that didn't come to me that time, and I think people need to know this, I insert it. Because to me, every time on that river is a time on that river. So, or if I have a life experience that people, in this book, there's some vignettes, like there's one I often call chairs, or there's the one about my grandmother making wine. Those actually, I wrote those separately as I was thinking of those ideas, and then I thought, here's where it fits. So, because it tied into something I really wanted to share. So I hope anybody who does read, and one thing I really do hope is that more people in the UK read this and the sequels, not because of trying to sell books, but because I think it's really beautiful that we all have a common connection. And I could say the same thing if I was talking to an angler in Abruzzo, Italy, or in Spain, or, wherever. There's a common connection. We all have that same language. And that's why I'm always reading from anglers of other places and learning their worlds. We see how much is different and how much is the same, and I love it.
Yeah. And it's like you say, bass is something we don't know so much about over here. I've learnt about them. I love the sound of it. But like you say, that thread of fly fishing, and one of the I wrote something. I said I found it wonderfully descriptive and thoughtful writing that at times felt reflective with just the merest hint of melancholy, but delivered with wonderful emotion. And that, I think, if people feel the way that we do, they'll get casting forward. It's just easy to read and absorb from that point of view. And it doesn't matter, it's not trout, it's about fishing. And I think that's the cool thing about it.
I have to say that I am really taken with how much you have, in your very quick read of the book, picked up on the things that I most hoped people picked up on. And I'm very thankful. Yes, there is a melancholy in it, for sure. But where our commonality is it may not be that someone served in the Marines and served on police forces and in counterterrorism, and that's where some of the melancholy comes from. But we all have something. We all have something that we struggle through, questions that we deal with. But the resounding message in everything I write is it's all good. No worries. Life is beautiful. And that's why I called it Casting Forward. Because no matter what happens, I tell people keep casting forward. It gets better. Things, you learn, you move on.
Yeah, no. One of the other things I liked about it, and the reason, I know we've been trying to set this up for quite some time, but I couldn't get a copy of the book, and it didn't feel right to talk to you having not read it. So I made sure I read it, and I'm a convert. I'm in. I really, really enjoyed that. And I loved the quote that you say, the river teaches me about the forward cast and the tree branches teach me about my back cast.
Definitely. In the second book, I talk about the dendrology of my fishing. In other words, all the different trees I've captured all over the world with my fly line. So, but yeah, there's so much to be learned from your forward cast and your back cast, both, metaphorically. There's so much to be learned. And one of the things I often say is I've torn the rearview mirror off of my life vehicle and thrown it out the window. I only look back to learn something. Beside that, I don't look back, and I don't look that far forward either. I'm trying to live right now. While you and I are speaking, my whole world is this conversation. And it's easy to lose that nowadays. You think about when you're fly fishing, you're in that moment. You're in that little piece of water. I think John Gierach wrote something to the effect once that for a trout, it's his entire experience in life, his whole universe is a little space behind a rock. And that's true for all of us. We have this little world and we think we know all of it. So, but it translates. I'm really grateful for your comments about the book. You really are encapsulating exactly what I hoped to share with people. And as you probably know, this was a 3-year labor of love to do this. I've gotten faster.
But you sense that within the book, that, like I said, about how it flows and how you can feel that when you're reading it, which definitely comes across to people. So yeah, I would hope that people will consider having a look at this this book over in the UK as well, because it's just for a lovely piece of angling writing as well. So I love it from that point of view. And you mentioned Bob White as well, the painter Bob White. And again, we were talking off mic beforehand about the lovely little symmetry or community that we live in. And, you know, we've got Bob in the new issue of Fly Culture, and Adrian's interviewed him. And we've got a picture in there that I've had hanging on my wall for 15, 18 years now. My wife bought me a copy of his book on the back of the article when she was editing it as well. And obviously he's been involved with your books too.
Yes. Like I don't hold back. I owe a lot to Bob White. I openly say he's one of the best men I've ever met in my life. And we communicate all the time. As a matter of fact, I'm really honored to be invited as the guest at his Muskie Madness in September. So we'll be up, he and I and his wife Lisa, and we'll be up there with 12 intrepid anglers on the Chippewa River, Flambeau River in Wisconsin, seeking giant muskie. So he's a great guy and a wonderful artist. For me, when Bob paints, and I have other friends who are excellent artists, and I love their work, but Bob is the only artist that transports me in the way he does. Somehow I see his painting, and suddenly I'm fishing with my dad. Suddenly I'm on that river, and I know the story. Do you know what I mean? He has this unique, and he has, I'll tell you a quick story. Bob and I were in his truck we were either in Wisconsin or Minnesota, probably Minnesota, and we're driving along, and he stops at a stop sign, and he looks up, and I think, what is he looking at? And he says, "That's a great sky. I'd like to paint that sky." That's how I feel about words. I'll see the sky, and that's a great sky. I want to write that sky. So, great guy.
Yeah, no, big fans, and it's been lovely to see that artwork as well. So thoroughly enjoyed that. So the food's awesome down there as well. As I said, I touched on where you mentioned where you sit and wait for a jug of sangria to turn up, and the tacos and the food and everything else. You're just selling. You should be working for the Texas government, I think, selling Texas, because you've done a wonderful job there, I tell you.
Well, I'm almost afraid that I've done a wonderful job, because I'd actually selfishly don't want to see a bunch of people on the rivers where I'm so peaceful. But, wherever I go, I just had this talk with a friend. I'm going to be flying out to California to fish for Corbina for my third book. And I was explaining to her, wherever I go, I need to eat the local food. I'm not looking for fancy places. I'm going, where do you go? Where's that hole in the wall that has something that's very LA or very, very much the Scottish Highlands or where I happen to be? I want to know, what do we have here? Because culture and community comes from food and drink and time together, just like fly fishing causes that as well. Fly fishing is beautiful. You mentioned about our daughters. You can go fishing together, but you also have solitude at the same time. You know what I mean? You may be 50 feet apart from each other, and you're cheering each other on when you catch one. But you're also having moments of peace. And the same thing happens over food. It brings people together, but it also it's a peace-giving thing. So to me, through food, we learn culture. And in Texas, like everywhere else, and by the way, Texas is like its own country, so it's very, very different in different regions. The hill country is unique. But what you learn is that our food comes from everywhere else. Some of our food is from the UK, some of our food is from Spain, some of our food is, people think Italy, they think tomatoes and pasta, but pasta comes from China and tomatoes come from Mexico. But potatoes don't come from Ireland, they come from Peru. It just shows the connectivity of people. So yes, if you or anyone comes to the Texas Hill Country, you've got to try the Tex-Mex. You've got to try the barbecue and so many other things. Other people don't realize too that this is wine country. We are a very large wine appellation. I think people say that grapevines have to suffer to make good wine. And the Texas Hill Country is a great place for plants to suffer because it's always dry and rocky. So we have some very good wines.
Awesome. Yep, you've done a wonderful job of selling Texas, the fishing. Steve, if people would like to get hold of you or get hold of the book, how do they do so, so that they can find it and read it? I would strongly recommend to people, if you're into fly fishing, if you're into good writing, that you should be considering buying Casting Forward, because I think you'll thoroughly enjoy it. But how can people get hold of you, Steve?
Well, to get a hold of me, the first thing I would say is my writer's website is just steveramirezauthor.com. That's very easy, and they can write to me on that, and from there we can connect, and I can give them other ways to connect with me directly. So that's the easiest way, because then they can also purchase the book through the website through multiple sources. The book is sold through every way anybody knows, from Amazon to Barnes and Noble, all, and straight from the author. I'm not straight from the author, straight from the publisher. So you can get it online. You can get it through any source like that. And I recommend you get it the cheapest you can. But I have to tell you, I'm about to buy 20 more of my own book, and because I have to buy them too, and it because I know what I'm doing with this. And these are going to make beautiful little sets, because the next one is going to have the Rocky Mountains up top and fast water down below. And then the ocean one's going to have, like you would think, ocean. And they're meant to go together. And I know that we're in our second printing now. And if there isn't a third printing, there won't be any more hard copies. So I'm buying a bunch for myself. Yes, you can get it anywhere. Some booksellers do sell it at a lower price than others because they're buying in mass. So that's something I'll give you as a hint. And sometimes people say, well, what's the best way for it? It doesn't make any difference to me. Get the best deal you can. But I really want people to read it, not because of selling books, because I think we need to connect. And it doesn't matter how hard you write. If no one reads it, it doesn't really matter, does it? If I was rich, I'd buy the whole lot and give them away.
Yeah. Steve, I think that's quite a big clue as well, isn't it? If the author's buying the books for himself because they're getting short, that gives you an indication of how popular it is and continues to be. So, like I say, I hope you'll consider buying a copy of Casting Forward, because it really is a wonderful book. I'm not paid to say this. I just feel it's a really special piece of writing, and I think it's really important to share that with people. So, Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. I've really, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Pete, the pleasure truly is all mine. And the next time I fly to the UK, I am going to see if you're available. So, and you do the same if you come to Texas. Thank you so much, and for those wonderful, insightful questions.
You're welcome. And I've a sense, having spoken to you today and off mic and emails, we'll definitely fish together. There's no doubt in my mind about that. So please, if you can get over, make sure you get in contact with me and we'll wet a line on my beloved river tour. And thank you again for taking the time to speak with me today, Steve.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. This has been the Fly Culture Podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this one as much as me. As ever with these podcasts, I don't often say, but these are all recorded in real time. So they're not edited. They're exactly the conversation you're seeing is exactly the conversation I've just had. I always believe it's really important to capture everything as it actually happens. And so you won't see this heavily edited or changed in any way, shape or form. So I hope you've enjoyed this and the honesty of it and the honesty opportunity of having this conversation. I've really, really enjoyed it, and I hope you'll be looking forward to some more podcasts very, very soon. But thank you so much, everyone, for listening.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.